This morning's scripture reading will come from Philippians 2, 12 through 15. Philippians 2, 12 through 15. Therefore, my beloved, as you are, have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my abundance. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. Do all these things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in this world.
I'm glad to see each of you here today, and I hope everybody's doing well and has had a good week. Go ahead and, if you're there, turn back, or maybe it's the same opening, to Philippians Chapter 1. And this is the primary text of our lesson will be from Philippians 2, but I want to look at a few things before we get into the main part of the lesson. Have a good number today. We have some visitors, and we're always thankful for you and hope that you enjoy your time with us and benefit from our worship together with God. And as was said earlier, if you have any questions about anything you see or hear while you are with us, please ask, and we will be more than happy to talk with you and do what we can to answer those questions. Our invitation song after a little while will be All to Jesus I Surrender. The book of Philippians has traditionally been called the book of joy. You know, I would say probably the best known verse in Philippians is 4:4. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. And as you look throughout each chapter, that word joy or the word rejoice appears at least one time in each chapter. For example, Chapter 1 and verse 4, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making request with joy. And then you look into Chapter 2, verse 2, fulfill ye my joy, that ye be like-minded. Chapter 3, finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord, verse 1. And then, of course, Philippians Chapter 4, I already mentioned verse 4, but then you look at verse 1, therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown. It is obvious that Paul had a special relationship with this congregation and that they meant a lot to him. And I think it's right to approach Philippians from that perspective, talking about joy and rejoicing. But as I studied through the entire book this week a couple of times, reading it and thinking about things as I was putting this together, and the title of the lesson is Becoming Blameless and Harmless. I want us to consider what that means, but as I studied through this book this week, you see that element of joy throughout the text. No question about that. But I see something else throughout the text in every chapter. And as I began to notice that and make note of that, it made me think there's a reason why he talked about their need for joy and the fact that they are his joy and that they should rejoice in the Lord, because in each chapter, just like joy is mentioned, there is also the possibility of division. And we know from the other writings that Paul has throughout the New Testament that division was a problem in the first century church. For instance, chapter 1 here, verse 15, some indeed preach Christ out of envy and strife, and some others of goodwill. The one preached Christ out of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bond. So people were going around preaching in hopes not to convert people to Christ, but to make Paul's imprisonment a little bit worse. And I don't know how exactly that would play out, but that's what he writes here. They're preaching out of envy and strife, and so you see division. And so then you get down to chapter 1 and verse 27. He says, only let your conduct be as becometh the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of your affairs, that you stand fast in one spirit, with one mind striving together. And again, maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I infer from what he said there in verse 27 that perhaps some weren't doing that. Perhaps some weren't striving together with one spirit and one mind for the faith of the gospel. There seems to be some contention in Philippi, so far as I can tell in reading the text. Well, you get to chapter 2, and you read the first 5 verses there. Look at verses 3 and 4. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every one on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Apparently that needed to be told to them. He doesn't write things just for the sake of writing them. And so while joy is laced throughout the text, so is this concept of division and encouragements towards unity. Look, for instance, at chapter 3, verse 15. Let us therefore, as many as be mature, be thus minded. And if anything else ye be otherwise minded, God will reveal even this unto you. Nevertheless, whereto we have already attained, let us walk by the same rule, let us mind the same thing. You've got to stay on track in unity. And then you get to chapter 4, verse 2. I beseech Euodias and Syntyche that they be of the same mind. Verse 3, and the rest of you need to help them out. So, yes, there's no question that Philippians is a book of joy, but I also see throughout these 4 chapters maybe why he writes so much about joy and unity, because there does seem to be some contention going on. So in Philippians chapter 2, we'll just start in verse 15. That ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. I want you to look at those 2 words, blameless and harmless. And you notice how verse 15 starts, that ye may be. And it would be better translated, that ye may become. And the way Paul writes that there in the Greek language, it's called the subjunctive mood, and it means this is the mood of probability, the mood of possibility, that you may become. Well, again, these things aren't written this way by accident. He wants them to become this way, and it's possible that they don't. It's possible that sometimes Christians are not blameless and harmless as children of God without rebuke. And so his admonition is in that direction, that you might do this. Again, I see it's not just joy that is a primary concept that he's writing about, but that's not it. It's possible to not be blameless and harmless. Well, then the question comes up, what does it mean to be blameless and harmless? And as the King James says here, without rebuke. Well, so let's look at those 2 words. The first word, blameless, appears, I think it's 6 times in your New Testament. And it has the idea of being without fault. Well, you guys know just as well as I do that a Christian can conduct himself or herself in such a way that they are not blameless, that they are not without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. So here are just a couple of uses of that. Well, there's one in this book. Look at Philippians chapter 3 and verse 6. Concerning zeal, this is Paul talking about his pre-conversion condition. He says, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, without fault. Paul kept the law of Moses, and he did so without fault. Well, we're in the neighborhood. Let's look at another verse. Turn over a couple pages to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. It's illustrating what this word blameless means. 1 Thessalonians 3, notice verse 13. To the end he may establish your hearts unblameable in holiness before God. So it is possible that you and I can stand in the sight of God as without fault. Now that does not mean that you're sinless. Being without fault doesn't mean you're perfect. But you're living above sin. You're living apart from it. And that's what the Christian's called to do. And we understand, well, it's like 1 John chapter 1 tells us, if any of you say you haven't sinned, you're a liar and the truth is not in you. We get that. But it's possible while we're in that condition and walking in the light as He is in the light, to at the same time be blameless and without fault. And so the way Paul says it there in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 is unblameable in holiness before God. And that's our concern. What does God think of me? Well, I can be without blame, without fault before God. So go back to Philippians 2, that ye may be blameless. Again, it's a possibility that you're not. And that all depends on you and how you conduct yourself in the world. But then the second word, harmless. I think a lot of times when we think of the word harmless, we think of something that's, I heard a good illustration of something that was harmless. A rabbit is a harmless animal. What does it do when it's attacked? Well, it either freezes or it runs. Now, that's not descriptive of how a Christian is to conduct himself. You freeze or run. That's the concept of being harmless. And, well, that's not what this word means. It's interesting. This word's very interesting to me. So let's look at a couple passages. Turn over to Romans chapter 16, and I'll show you another way that this word is used in the New Testament. What does it mean to be harmless? It doesn't mean that you don't have any... It doesn't mean that you don't have any influence. It doesn't mean that you don't have any strength or fortitude. That's not what this word means at all. So look at Romans chapter 16 and verse 19. He says, "For your obedience is come abroad unto all men. I am glad therefore on your behalf. But yet I would have you wise unto that which is good, and simple concerning evil." This is the same word that's translated as harmless. And what this word in the Greek language means is without mixture. And one of the definitions that I found, listen to this, I really like this. So, that you may become blameless and harmless. Here's the word harmless. Not tainted with sinful motives. Now, plug that into the context of Philippians where, yes, throughout he's talked about joy, but also throughout the text he's talked about the possibility of division and envy and strife and striving. And now he's telling them, I want you to be without fault and not tainted with any sinful motives. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15. So that you may be lights in the world. So that you can shine forth as an example. So there's some things that come out here. So how do we get there? How do we become blameless and harmless? Understanding that it's possible that you might not be. That's what I want us to focus on from chapter 2. So go ahead and let's go to Philippians 2. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to note some things that are written before you get down to verse 15. The first thing that I see, and obviously this study's from my perspective, you may see some things that I don't grab onto, and that's perfectly fine. One of the ways that we can become blameless or without fault and not being tainted with sinful motivations in our lives is in verse 2. "Fulfill ye my joy, that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and one mind." One of the ways that we accomplish what we're trying to accomplish is by being submissive and like-minded. What do I mean to be submissive? Well, I think of Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 22. Paul said, "Submit yourselves one to another." And he's talking to the church as a whole. Typically, I think, when we think about the church submitting, we talk about the membership submitting to the lead of the eldership. And sure. But the Bible also teaches that we are willing to yield to one another so that we can become without fault and not tainted with sinful motivations. See, we all have our own motivations. And there are some things that come out in the text that show us how that might work out. While initially they may be private, they will eventually work out and be manifested to everybody. So the first thing we need to do is be willing to submit to one another, Philippians 2 and verse 2, and be like-minded. Think of each other equally. And that kind of comes out in the next one. This is our second point. Number 1, be submissive and be like-minded. Number 2 is from verses 3 and 4. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. I think the New King James, I don't have it with me, I think it says in selfish ambition or conceit. I believe that's the way it reads there. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. See, the world teaches us to do the exact opposite, doesn't it? You don't do that in our world to advance, whether in your career or in your socioeconomic status. You don't lower yourself. You've got to advance yourself. Well, we're talking about something quite different here. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. So, be submissive and like-minded. Number 2, watch your selfish ambition and your conceit. This is a person who wants it his way or her way, and any other way is wrong. There is no compromise. There's no looking at things from your perspective. And we're not talking about things that matter, like matters of what we call matters of salvation. This is talking about your conduct in life in general, and you're dealing with each other in life in general. So one way we could think of it is, the way I've put it before is, believe it or not, the world does not revolve around me. And believe it or not, the world doesn't revolve around you. But sometimes we can get like that, and we're not willing to submit and be like-minded, and we're full of selfish ambition and conceit. You know what it means to be conceited? Narcissism is a word we typically hear. Completely self-interested. If we're going to be a place that, well, look at Philippians Chapter 2 and verse 1. He talks about the consolation in Christ and comfort of love and fellowship of the Spirit and affection and mercy. If that's going to be descriptive of me as an individual and of us as a congregation, then we don't put ourselves and our selfish ambition and conceit first. We're willing to yield. In fact, James chapter 3 and verse 18 tells us that the wisdom from above is willing to yield. I don't have to have my way all the time. And you don't have to have your way all the time. And if that's the way we conduct ourselves, then we are not being blameless and harmless as children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. In fact, we're acting just like a crooked and perverse generation if we think we are the most important person in the room. Submit and be like-minded. Watch your selfish ambitions and conceits. And here's third, verse 5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Think like Jesus thought. And then he illustrates what that means in verses 6 through 11. Who being in the form of God did not consider it something to be held on to be equal with God. That word robbery there in verse 6. He didn't hold on to his position because he didn't want to come down here and do what God's will was. Instead, he made of himself no reputation. So he is the exact opposite of verse 3. Selfish ambition and conceit. He willfully took upon himself something lower than he was. If we're going to be harmless and blameless, or without fault, and not mixed with sinful motivations, then we've got to be like Christ and be willing to submit our way, maybe to somebody else's way. Maybe we are not right all the time. Maybe we're not perfect. Believe it or not, we're not. Now Christ was, and He set that perfect model for us. He was found in fashion as a man, and He humbled Himself. And there it is. That's the key. Verse 8. He humbled Himself and became obedient. I think of Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 8. Though He were a son, yet He learned obedience. Now that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't know how to obey God before He came to earth and died. It means He experienced it. And then He displayed it for us. This is what it means to humble yourself and be found in fashion as He did. And the results of that, verses 9 through 11, God exalted Him. And again, that's a complete flip of the world, because the world tells you to exalt yourself and to assert yourself. And the Bible says you humble yourself and you watch your selfish ambition and you watch your conceit. So how do we become blameless and harmless? Submit and be like-minded. Watch your selfish ambition and your conceit, and think like Jesus thought. But here's number 4. Look down at verse 12. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Notice, I'm going to emphasize something here. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Well, why emphasize that? The word work out there means to bring something to its completion, to finish something out to its end point. Your own salvation. Now, he's talking to Christians here, so obviously he's not telling them, hey, whatever y'all need to do to be saved, that's what you do, and leave everybody else alone. That's how some people actually take Philippians 2 and verse 12. That's not at all what he is saying. He's talking to Christians, and if you want to see the birth of the church in Philippi, you need to read Acts chapter 16. Remember, it started with Lydia and the women on the side of the river, and then you have the Philippian jailer who was converted to Christ, and so you have the birth of the church there. He's talking to people who have already become Christians. What he's telling them to do is you finish what you started as a Christian, and you do your own. I think one of the greatest challenges, and I would say for me too, particularly as a preacher, It is not my job to work out your own salvation. Your own salvation. It's not my job, and I can't work out anybody's salvation. And you can't work out anybody's salvation. You have to take to the end your own salvation with fear and trembling. And so that's a message of stay faithful. If you want to become blameless and harmless, work out your own salvation. You keep on, as we say. Keep on keeping on. We hear that sometimes in sermons and Bible classes. That's what he's saying in Philippians 2 and verse 12. And so that's the next point there. Carry out to the finish line your own salvation. It's kind of like Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 12, where we are told to run with patience the race that is set before us. Nobody can run your race for you, and nobody can run my race for me. You mind your own business as a Christian. You focus on your process of becoming blameless and harmless, and you work that out unto its final point. Now, that doesn't mean we can't. That doesn't mean we can't do what the Bible says to, like Galatians 6 and verse 1. If any of you are overtaken in a fault, then you which are spiritual restore such a one. This doesn't mean you can't do that. But this has more that concept, again, of elevating oneself and not concerning yourself with your own salvation, but everybody else's. If you do that, well, you're not being blameless, you're not being without fault, and you're not without some bad motivations. We've got to pay attention to ourselves and take care of our own. Well, we had a lady in Middle Tennessee. She would say, sweep your own, how did she say it? Sweep your own doorstep first. And that's the concept here of Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12. Verse 14. Do all things without murmurings and disputings. I've looked at this word murmur before, and it kind of hit me differently this time because there's a primary definition. And you know, when you look at a dictionary, even an English dictionary, you'll get that. You'll have a word, and then you'll have a very primary use of that word, typically a very brief definition. But you guys know just as well as I do that words, the meaning of a word comes out within the context in which it is used. And so a very fundamental or basic definition of murmur is kind of a low volume complaint. It's kind of a grumble that you can hear. Like if you were in a crowd, you couldn't make out what was being said, but you could tell something wasn't right. But I want you to listen to this. Listen to the secondary definition of this term. And I had to read it a couple of times for myself to get it. Murmur. Secret displeasure, not openly avowed. Secret displeasure, not openly avowed. So you're unhappy about something. You're murmuring within yourself, and you've not vocalized it yet. It's not manifested itself yet to maybe a spouse or a fellow Christian or whoever, but it's within you. You're murmuring. You have that low kind of rumble that, again, if you were in a crowd, you couldn't make out what was being said, but you know something's not right. Do all things without secret displeasure, not openly avowed. And I know that's a bit wordy, but that definition means something, because then he says, and disputing. See, eventually those secret displeasures that are not in the moment openly avowed, they're going to come out and show themselves as disputes. And how many times have we seen that in congregations where disputes arise out of complaints because somebody is not working out their own salvation? They're worried about somebody else, and they're gossips, and they're busybodies. And the secret displeasure that at the moment was not openly avowed now becomes a dispute. That's what he's saying here. How do we become blameless and harmless? Watch your murmuring. Keep yourself under control. Work out your own salvation. You know, and that's kind of the thing. If we do that, if we're more concerned about keeping ourselves in line, as we say, I'm not going to have time to worry about what everybody else is doing. And again, that doesn't mean that we neglect what the Bible tells us to do, like if a sheep wanders away, to go out and find that sheep. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with selfish, going back up through the text, people who will not submit and who will not be like-minded. We're talking about people who have selfish ambitions and conceits, and people who don't have the mind of Christ as the text progresses, and that's what we're dealing with here. One of the words that I thought of as I was making some notes, so I don't have a PowerPoint today, I used my legal pad to write this out. And I've got arrows and all kinds of stuff moving around. But one of the words that I thought of when I read that definition of murmur, secret displeasure, not openly avowed, was the word malcontent. And I suppose you know what that word means of a person. Nothing is ever good enough, and they're not happy, and they'll always find something to complain about. Well, a malcontent who complains. And that disputing is the meaning of that word is a calculation or a plot that you'll set. So now you have these things that you're upset about secretly, but then you're going to plot it out. You're going to let everybody else know about it. Well, if you do that, you're not blameless, you're not without fault, and you're not harmless. And remember the definition of harmless: not tainted with sinful motivations. Well, that's why he tells these Christians, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, because it's God who works in you, both to will and to do His good pleasure. But you know, by our discontent and complaining, murmurings and grumblings, our will can override God's will, and we'll behave in such a way that we be not blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke. In fact, we'll be the exact opposite of that. So what should we do? Well, verse 15 continuing here. Among whom ye shine as lights in the world. Well, how do you do that? Do you do it by secret displeasure, not openly avowed, and then by setting a plot to catch people? Or do you do it, verse 16, by holding forth the word of life? There's a major contrast there. There's a way that we are supposed to be living that will cause us to be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, the children of God, as the New King James says, without rebuke. And again, without rebuke and blameless doesn't mean sinlessly perfect, because we all know that not one of us is. But we can be without fault, and we can be, as we say, above reproach and not tainted with sinful motivations in this life. It's very easy, I would say, and I think you would agree with me, it's very easy to look at somebody else and find what they're doing wrong. And it's a lot more challenging to look at ourselves, for me to look at me and see what I need to fix. Because I know what they're doing wrong, and I would never, we say that sometimes, I would never do that. Well, you might want to be careful in saying what you would never do, because it's possible that you might not be blameless and harmless. And again, that's the challenge here in the midst of all of these encouragements of you are my joy and my rejoicing, my crown and glory, but y'all need to work together. So I talked about that a bit in the beginning. Look again at Philippians Chapter 4, and we looked at verse 2. Let's just start in verse 1. Philippians 4, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. So again, you can see the emotional plea and the connection that he has with these people. I beseech Euodias and beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind in the Lord. And I entreat thee also, true yokefellow, everybody else that I'm writing to in the congregation, help those women who labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, and with other my fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say rejoice. Let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. And it goes on from there. Excuse me. But so while you see I would say the overarching theme of joy and rejoicing, you see an undertone of trouble. And I think Paul addressed that throughout. We need to be, back to Philippians chapter 2 now, verses 15 and 16. You and I need to be shining as lights in the world, verse 15b. And we do so, verse 16, by holding forth the word of life. And that's the gospel. And we do that verbally, obviously, by sharing the gospel with people around us, but we also do it by the manner in which we live. And again, we go back through the text. How does that manifest itself in the world? Well, by being submissive and like-minded, by watching your selfish ambition and your conceitedness, by thinking like Christ thought, not trying to put yourself first in all things, and by working out your own salvation, verse 12, and by not having these murmurs and complaints that will eventually come out and cause difficulty. In opposition to all that, you shine as lights in the world by holding forth the word of life, by the way you conduct yourself, by the way you share that word of life with those who are around you. Why did he say that? Well, because he wanted to rejoice in the day of Christ. You know, over in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul talks about the day of Christ coming, and he compares the church to a house. And he said in some houses there are vessels of honor, you know, gold and silver, and then there are some vessels of straw and hay and wood and stubble and things like this. And the fire is going to reveal what type of work it is. And if you're doing what the Lord would have you to do, well, you're that gold and silver that's going to make it through the fires of judgment. But if you're the wood and the hay and the stubble, you're going to be burned up in judgment. And Paul was concerned about that in 1 Corinthians 3, and he didn't want to lose any of his work that he had labored for. Well, that's what he's saying here in Philippians 3:16, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. I hope I didn't waste my time among you, is what he's saying. Because we're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ one day, and that's what's going to reveal the nature of the work. And that's what's going to reveal the nature of each one of us. Whether we've been blameless and harmless, or these other things that we've talked about. Not submissive and conceited and not concerned so much about ourselves, but as we are about everybody else. We've got to be shining forth as lights in the world and holding forth the word of life in our daily conduct. Well, like I said, when we go back to Philippians 2 and verse 15, let's wrap this up. That ye may be blameless and harmless. It is possible that we as Christians are not, if we are not conducting ourselves properly, as this text and many other texts obviously in the Bible reveals. But that's on each one of us, isn't it? It's on each one of us to become blameless and harmless as sons of God. And so Paul's writing 2,000 years ago when he says, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Ours is no less crooked or perverse, is it? And we still have that responsibility in that context, societally, to be blameless and harmless and above reproach. But we have to be working out our own salvation with fear and trembling. And if we do that, when you look at Philippians 2 and verse 13, we have that assurance of God working with us as we're here. And that's what we want. And we want to be that light that shines in the darkness. Well, it may be the case that as you've been living in this world, as a Christian, perhaps you've not been doing that, being blameless and harmless. And we all have to, again, it's easier to look at everybody else and to see their good and their bad. It's a whole lot easier to do that than it is to have some self-reflection, some introspection. But that is absolutely necessary that we do that. Maybe there's somebody here this morning who needs to make things right with God. It may be that you need to be baptized into Christ in the first place because you've not become a Christian yet. You've not started conducting yourself in any way as a child of God in the world. Well, we want to encourage you to do that, believing that Christ is God's Son, repenting of sin in your life, and being baptized into Christ and beginning that walk. Maybe you're here this morning and you've done that in the past, but you've not remained faithful. You've not become blameless and harmless in the midst of this crooked and perverse generation. Well, let's change that today as children of God. If there's any need this morning, why don't you let us know right now as we stand and sing.